cardiovascular system, internal configuration of the heart. In this lesson, we will analyze how the four cavities that make up the heart are formed. Here, we can see a section. The heart was cut along the longitudinal plane and its major axis. Therefore, we can obtain this figure in which all four heart chambers can be seen. The first thing to take notice of is the fact that the heart chambers are separated in different ways. The right side and the left side of the heart are well separated, and there is an interatrial septum separating the atria, and there is also an interventricular septum. These septa prevent communication between the right and the left side of the heart. Actually, about 25% of the population has a minimum interruption in the interatrial septum. The separation between the atria and the ventricles is due to valves that have cusps or flaps. Their function is to close during ventricular systole in order to prevent blood from returning to the atria. But let's start by talking about the right atrium now. As can be seen, the external surface of the right atrium is made up of two portions, a posterior-inferior one that is called the vena cava sinus, where the superior vena cava unites with the inferior vena cava, and then there is the atrial portion that is the anterior superior portion. Internally, these two parts are partially divided in that are signs to distinguish them. First of all, it must be said that the vena cava sinus has a smooth surface, while on the anterior surface there are bumps called trabeculae, which make the surface appear irregular. There is a crest that separates the vena cava sinus from the rest of the atrium called the terminal crest, and that corresponds to the terminal sulcus visible on the external surface. The demarcation between the two areas is so net because they have different embryonic origin. In fact, the bulge that forms the vena cava sinus is only later joined to the bulge that forms the atrium. We can observe an interesting structure in the vena cava sinus, the ostium of the inferior vena cava, that has a rudimental valve called the Eustachian valve, probably a vestigial mechanism to avoid blood backflow. In front of the Eustachian valve, there is another small orifice that is also a rudimental valve. It is the outlet orifice of the coronary sinus, that is, the large vein that collects all the reflux blood from the heart, and, as we will see, it returns to the right atrium. The rudimental valve that covers it is called the Thebesian valve, and it is also an incomplete valve. After having described the vena cava sinus, let's describe the anterior portion of the right atrium. First of all, the entire right atrium can be assimilated to the form of a cube, so with about 6 faces, and some have very blurred boundaries. What else can we see in the rest of the right atrium? First of all, we can see that the lateral wall is wrinkled, but doesn't have large structures. The inferior wall and the part of the anterior wall of the atrium are missing due to the presence of a large tricuspid valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. The anterior wall of the right atrium extends ahead to form the right auricle that robs the emergence of the ascending aorta. Lastly, on the medial wall of the right atrium, there is a small, barely visible cleft called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is nothing more than a residue of an interatrial communication existent during fetal development, called the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale normally occludes at birth, even though in some people this may not happen. For example, 25% of the general population has an incompletely closed foramen ovale. Nonetheless, in most of these people, it does not cause any problems because it is a very small hole. Instead, when the patent foramen ovale is symptomatic, that means that the interatrial defect is very large. In normal subjects, the fossa ovalis isn't a foramen. It is a thinning of the interatrial septum, but is not patent. But what is the benefit of the interatrial communication during fetal development? In short, this hole serves so that blood that in the fetus arrives only through venous circulation can pass to the left part of the heart and begin arterial circulation. But before talking about the right ventricle, let's observe the tricuspid valve. It's a valve that has, as the name implies, three cusps, simply called anterior, posterior, and medial. The tricuspid valve has valve cusps that are well anchored by the papillary muscles. In fact, thanks to the papillary muscles, the valve is anchored in the ventricle, and when the ventricle contracts, this prevents the valve from opening into the atria and also blood backflow. But let's talk about the real structure of the right ventricle. The right ventricle also has a wrinkled or receptive part that is the one in which blood from the atrium falls as soon as the valves open, and the smooth part, the infundibular, that makes up the outlet cone of the pulmonary trunk. The boundary between these two parts is made up of a series of very important structures from the anatomical point of view. There is the first structure called the supraventricular crest that continues to a second structure called marginal septum trabecula, which continues below until the largest of the papillary muscles, that is the anterior papillary muscle that is attached to the chordae tendineae of the anterior cusp of the tricuspid valve. These three structures form an incomplete division between the receptive part, wrinkled, and the infundibular part that instead is smooth. The infundibular part has the shape of a cone and ends forming the orifice of the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk's orifice has a valve different from those that we can see at the atrioventricular level. It is a semilunar valve that has three cusps that are called anterior, right, and left. These three cusps are concave on the superior side and convex on the ventricular side. They also have a fibrous ring with which they anchor to the outlet cone of the right ventricle, and at the center, at the point where they come into contact, there is a nodule called the Bergogni nodule that, in an elderly patient, can calcify. Lastly, we have to talk about the wrinkled part of the right ventricle. The carinae trabeculae present in the wrinkled part are not all the same. In fact, they are classified in three orders. Therefore, the third order trabeculae are only small bumps on the endocardium. Then, there are the second order trabeculae, like the septum marginal trabeculae, which are attached to the heart walls only at their origin and at their end, and therefore are shaped like a bridge. Lastly, we have the first order trabeculae that corresponds to the papillary muscles that are attached to the heart walls only at one end, while the other is attached to the valve chordae tendineae. Well, now we can talk about the left atrium. The left atrium has a simpler structure than the right atrium. First of all, it shares the medial wall. It also has a small hollow spot on the medial wall surrounded by a residue of a valve called the semilunar plica. It is divided into two parts, somewhat like the right atrium, but less evident. At the posterior part is the pulmonary vein sinus that seems almost flat and where the four pulmonary veins arrive without having entrance valves. It has an anterior portion on which on the anterior face we can see the mitral valve that usually has two cusps, and along the anterior wall we see that it prolongs into a cavity that makes up the left auricle, which embraces the exit of the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle. The left ventricle has a very similar structure to the right ventricle, in that it is also divided into a receptive portion just below the valve and an infundibular portion that forms the emergence cone of the aorta. In the receptive portion, we find two carinae trabeculae that are very similar to those of the right ventricle. And we can also find two papillary muscles, an anterior and a posterior one, which receive the chordae of the two cusps of the mitral valve that are simply called anterior cusp and posterior cusp. Like the tricuspid, the mitral also has a fibrous ostium with which the atrioventricular junction is anchored. The emergence cone culminates in the aorta's orifice. Here we can also see a valve made up of three semilunar cusps that are very similar to those seen at the pulmonary trunk and that also present a central bulge of the three cusps that here is called nodule of Arrhenius. A last note goes to the interventricular septum, whose muscular and fibrous composition can be easily noticed in this section. The inferior part of the septum is muscular, while the very first part is made up of a fibrous septum that we'll see better in the next video. As can be seen, the fibrous septum is very small, but it is extremely important because it anchors the muscular fibers that make up the muscular septum. This video was created thanks to Anatomy Learning, an interesting free web app. The hyperlink can be found in the description. Instead, the text used for the concepts is Human Anatomy of Eddie Hermes. Thanks for watching.